A single map, discovered in a bombed-out farmhouse in 1944, would expose the most catastrophic intelligence failure of World War II, and force Allied commanders to tear up their entire invasion strategy in just 72 hours. But the real story of how that map was found, what it revealed, and the desperate race against time it triggered, is so much darker and more complex than anything you've heard before. British Lieutenant James Harwood wasn't looking for anything unusual when his unit cleared the rubble near Cannes on a freezing morning in March 1944. Just another routine sweep of abandoned German positions that had been pounded by artillery for 3 days straight. The kind of tedious, dangerous work that killed more soldiers through accidents and booby traps than actual combat. His squad was moving through what remained of a stone farmhouse, checking for survivors or supplies, when Private Dennis Cooper stepped on a loose floorboard and fell through into a hidden cellar that nobody knew existed. Harwood climbed down, expecting to find wine bottles or maybe black market goods. But instead, he found Cooper standing in ankle-deep water, holding a leather case that had been wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. The kind of preservation you only use for documents that absolutely cannot be allowed to deteriorate. Inside that case were 43 pages of the most detailed defensive intelligence anyone had ever seen. Complete maps showing every gun emplacement, every minefield, every observation post, every single defensive position along a 200-mile stretch of the Atlantic Wall, with notations in perfect German military script indicating the exact number of troops, the caliber of weapons, and most terrifyingly, the specific locations and movement schedules of Rommel's reserve panzer divisions. The problem wasn't just that the Allies had been wrong about German defenses, it was that they had been catastrophically, fatally wrong, in ways that would have turned D-Day into the worst military disaster in modern history. Everything Allied intelligence believed about where the Germans expected an invasion was based on months of careful analysis of troop movements, decoded radio traffic, and reports from French resistance networks. And all of that analysis had pointed to the same conclusion. The Germans believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, which meant their strongest defenses and their mobile reserve forces would be concentrated there, leaving other potential landing sites like Normandy relatively vulnerable. But this map told a completely different story, one that made senior intelligence officers physically ill when they saw it, because it showed that Hitler had secretly moved 3 entire SS Panzer divisions, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, and the 21st Panzer Division, to positions within striking distance of the Normandy beaches, positioned in a way that suggested someone in German high command knew exactly where the Allies were planning to land. The map showed these divisions hidden in forests and Norman villages, camouflaged and dispersed to avoid aerial reconnaissance, ready to move to the beaches within 2 to 3 hours of the first landing, which meant that Allied troops waiting ashore would face not just fixed defenses, but a coordinated armored counterattack while they were still most vulnerable, still establishing beachheads, still bringing heavy weapons ashore. Historians who studied the documents after the war estimated that if those panzer divisions had been allowed to counterattack as planned, casualties on D-Day would have exceeded 80,000 men in the first 24 hours. The beachheads would have been contained or destroyed, and the entire invasion could have failed, potentially extending the war by years and giving Germany time to develop atomic weapons or negotiate a separate peace with the Soviet Union. Lieutenant Harwood, following standard protocols, immediately sealed the farmhouse, posted guards, and sent an encrypted message to headquarters using a one-time cipher pad. And within 6 hours, the site was swarming with intelligence officers from MI6, American OSS, and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, all trying to determine if what they were seeing was real or the most sophisticated deception operation the Germans had ever attempted. Eisenhower was woken at 3 a.m. at his headquarters outside London and given a summary of the findings. And witnesses later reported that the Supreme Commander, normally unflappable under pressure, went pale and had to sit down because he immediately understood the implications, not just for the invasion, but for his career, his reputation, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of men under his command. The Supreme Allied Command went into emergency session at 6 a.m., and the meeting that followed would become legendary in military circles for the raw tension and the life-or-death stakes being debated, with some generals like Bernard Montgomery arguing that the map had to be a German plant, an elaborate deception designed to make the Allies change their plans at the last minute and play into Hitler's hands, while others like Omar Bradley insisted that the level of detail and the corroboration with existing intelligence made it too risky to ignore. The argument that won the day came from an unlikely source, a British signals intelligence officer named Reginald Jones, who had spent the entire war analyzing German technological capabilities and deception tactics, and who pointed out that the map contained information about experimental radar installations and new mine designs that matched signals intercepts and aerial photographs that the Germans had no reason to believe the Allies possessed, which meant that if this was a deception, the Germans would have had to know about multiple other intelligence breaches that they had given no indication of knowing about. But even accepting that the map was genuine created a cascade of impossible problems, because by March 1944, the invasion plan known as Operation Overlord was essentially finalized. With millions of maps printed and distributed, thousands of officers briefed on their specific roles, ships being loaded with supplies marked for specific beaches, airborne divisions training for drops on specific drop zones, and an entire logistical apparatus designed to support landings at 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, all in Normandy. Changing the plan at this point wasn't like revising a strategy. It was like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around in a bathtub. And some officers argued it was literally impossible, that the momentum of preparation was too great, that trying to change everything would create chaos and confusion that would be worse than landing in the face of known German positions. Churchill was brought into the discussion on the second day, flying to Eisenhower's headquarters in a state of barely controlled fury, reportedly demanding to know how British and American intelligence could have failed so completely to detect the movement of 3 entire armored divisions. And the answer he received was even more disturbing than the question. The intelligence hadn't failed. It had been deliberately manipulated, because the Germans had moved those divisions using a technique called blending, where they broke up the divisions into company and battalion-sized units, moved them at night using farm roads and forest tracks, billeted them in civilian buildings and barns scattered across the countryside, and maintained the radio signatures and supply patterns of their original positions using elaborate deception units. Churchill reportedly sat in silence for 20 minutes after receiving this briefing, chain-smoking cigars, while his staff waited in uncomfortable silence, because he knew exactly what this meant for Britain's future, for the thousands of young men who would die if the invasion failed, for his own legacy and his relationship with Roosevelt and Stalin, and for the possibility that this might be Britain's last chance to have a decisive say in how Europe would be reconstructed after the war. The decision that came out of those 72 hours of emergency meetings was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying in its audacity. Because instead of canceling or postponing D-Day, instead of trying to find new landing beaches or completely redesigning the invasion, Allied Command decided to do something far more dangerous. They would keep the same landing beaches, they would proceed with the same basic plan, but they would launch the largest and most complex military deception operation in human history to make absolutely certain that when D-Day came, those German panzer divisions would be nowhere near Normandy. This is where the story transforms from a tale of intelligence failure into something approaching genius-level strategic thinking, because the Allies realized that the captured map gave them something more valuable than just knowledge of German positions. It gave them a window into German thinking, into what Hitler and his generals believed about Allied intentions, and that window could be exploited. The operation they designed, codenamed Bodyguard, was actually a series of interconnected deceptions so complex that it required its own headquarters staff, its own budget running into millions of pounds, and the coordination of intelligence services, military units, diplomatic channels, and even civilian agencies across multiple countries. The core of the deception was to convince Hitler that the Allies knew he expected an invasion at Normandy, and had therefore decided to invade somewhere else, specifically at Pas-de-Calais, which would force him to keep his strongest forces, including those panzer divisions, positioned to defend against an attack that would never come. To sell this deception, the Allies created an entirely fictional army group, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, who the Germans respected and feared as America's best tactical commander, and positioned in southeastern England, directly across from Calais. FUSAG existed only on paper and in German imagination, but the Allies made it real through an astonishing combination of physical props and electronic deception, building entire camps full of inflatable tanks and rubber aircraft that looked perfect from the altitude German reconnaissance planes flew at, generating massive amounts of fake radio traffic using the exact communications patterns that real army groups used, creating false supply dumps and pipeline systems, even arranging for Patton to be photographed at various FUSAG locations, and having him give speeches that were deliberately allowed to be monitored by German intelligence. The deception went far beyond simple trickery, extending into the realm of what we would now call information warfare, with British intelligence running a stable of double agents, German spies who had been captured and turned, who fed their handlers in Berlin a steady stream of reports that seemed to confirm FUSAG's existence and the plan to invade at Calais. The most important of these double agents was a Spaniard, codenamed Garbo, real name Juan Pujol Garcia, who had created an entire fictional network of sub-agents, supposedly scattered across Britain, each sending reports about troop movements and preparations that built up a completely false picture of Allied intentions. Garbo was so trusted by the Germans that his reports went directly to Hitler's desk, and in the months before D-Day, he sent over 500 messages, each one carefully crafted by British intelligence to reinforce the Calais deception while containing just enough accurate but harmless information to maintain his credibility. But the captured map created a new wrinkle in the deception plan, because Allied intelligence now knew exactly what the Germans knew about Allied preparations for Normandy, which meant they had to create a narrative that explained why the Allies would abandon such an elaborate plan. And the narrative they settled on was almost too clever, built on the assumption that the Germans would assume the Allies had discovered their map was missing and would therefore believe any intelligence suggesting the Normandy plan had been abandoned. This is where the operation enters the realm of four-dimensional chess, with each side trying to outthink the other's deceptions, and where that leather case found in the farmhouse became the key to the entire strategy. Allied intelligence made sure that German reconnaissance detected what appeared to be a scaling back of preparations in areas associated with the Normandy landings, allowing some double agents to report that there had been a major security scare and a possible compromise of invasion plans, while simultaneously increasing the visible activity around FUSAG and the fictional Calais invasion force. The timing had to be perfect, because if they moved too quickly, the Germans might suspect deception, but if they moved too slowly, the panzer divisions might remain in position near Normandy. So intelligence officers created a timeline that suggested a realistic period for Allied command to discover a security breach, debate options, make a decision, and begin implementing a new plan. Meanwhile, the actual preparations for the Normandy invasion continued in secret, with extraordinary security measures including the closing of the entire British coastline from the Wash to Land's End, restricting all civilian travel, monitoring all mail and telecommunications, and even detaining anyone who might have inadvertently learned details of the real plan. The French resistance played a crucial role in confirming that the map's intelligence was accurate, with networks across Normandy reporting on German troop movements, defensive constructions, and the locations of the panzer divisions. And these reports confirmed every major detail on the captured map, which eliminated any remaining doubt that the map was genuine and that the threat was real. As D-Day approached, the tension at Supreme Headquarters became almost unbearable, because despite all the deception efforts, despite Garbo's messages, and FUSAG's fake radio traffic, and the inflatable tanks, there was no way to be absolutely certain that Hitler would fall for it. No way to guarantee that those panzer divisions wouldn't be waiting on the beaches when the first landing craft hit shore. Eisenhower, bearing the weight of decision, drafted a letter taking full responsibility for the failure of the invasion, a letter he would release if the landings failed, and he kept it in his pocket on June 5th when he made the final decision to launch the invasion, despite questionable weather that threatened to scatter the airborne forces and disrupt the naval bombardment. The early morning hours of June 6, 1944, would reveal whether the greatest gamble in military history had paid off. As thousands of ships approached the Normandy coast, and tens of thousands of paratroopers jumped into the darkness over the Cotentin Peninsula and the area around Caen. And in those first crucial hours, the fate of the invasion hung on whether German armored forces would appear to crush the beachheads before they could be consolidated. The landings themselves were brutal, with particularly heavy casualties at Omaha Beach, where German defensive positions had been underestimated, and the preliminary bombardment had failed to destroy key strongpoints. But the one thing that didn't happen was the nightmare scenario the captured map had revealed: the coordinated panzer counterattack that would have driven the Allies back into the sea. The 21st Panzer Division did launch a limited counterattack near Sword Beach in the afternoon of D-Day, but it was a single division acting without support, easily contained by Allied naval gunfire and air superiority. Nothing like the crushing blow that 3 divisions could have delivered in the first hours of the invasion. Even more remarkably, the 12th SS Panzer Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division didn't move toward Normandy at all in the first 18 hours, held in position near Calais by direct orders from Hitler himself, who remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the real invasion, the main attack by Patton's Fusag, was still coming at Pas de Calais. This decision, to hold back Germany's strongest armored reserve during the most critical period of the invasion, when the Allied beachheads were most vulnerable, was arguably Hitler's greatest strategic blunder of the war, and it was caused directly by the deception operation that the captured map had enabled. The story of Lieutenant James Harwood and the leather case in the farmhouse should have ended there, with the success of D-Day and the beginning of the liberation of Europe. But in 1974, 30 years after the events, the British government released a tranche of classified intelligence files under the 30-year rule. And what those files revealed was so shocking that it changed the entire understanding of the operation. Lieutenant Harwood wasn't a lieutenant at all. He was Captain James Harwood of MI6, a career intelligence officer who had been operating undercover in France since 1943. And the discovery of the map wasn't an accident. It was a carefully staged operation designed to get specific intelligence into the hands of Allied command, in a way that would give them political cover to act on information they had already obtained through other means. The files revealed that British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been reading high-level German military communications through the Ultra program, and had known about the movement of panzer divisions to Normandy for weeks before the map was discovered. But the intelligence was so sensitive, and the source so valuable, that military commanders were prohibited from acting on it in ways that might reveal to the Germans that their codes were broken. This created an impossible situation where Allied intelligence knew about a lethal threat to the invasion, but couldn't use that knowledge without risking the loss of their greatest intelligence advantage. And the solution was to create an alternative source for the information, a captured map that would tell Allied commanders what they already knew, but give them a plausible reason for knowing it that didn't involve code breaking. The leather case and its contents were real German documents, but they hadn't been found by accident in a random farmhouse. They had been placed there deliberately by a German officer who was working for the Allies. A member of the anti-Hitler resistance within the Wehrmacht, who had been passing intelligence to MI6 through Switzerland for over a year. The officer's identity was revealed in the files as Oberst Heinrich von Schellenberg, a staff officer in Rommel's headquarters who had access to the Atlantic Wall defense plans, and who had become convinced after Stalingrad that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction, and that the only hope for a survivable peace was to help the Western Allies defeat Nazi Germany as quickly as possible. Schellenberg had photographed the documents at enormous personal risk, smuggled them to Switzerland, where they were copied by British intelligence, then had the copies aged and treated to look like they had been in storage for months before they were inserted into the leather case and prepared for the staged discovery. The farmhouse wasn't chosen randomly either. It had been identified by French resistance as a location that German forces were certain to abandon after a planned withdrawal, and the timing of the British patrol that found it had been carefully coordinated to occur within hours of the German evacuation, reducing the risk that other forces might find it first, or that German rearguard units might return and discover the planted evidence. Captain Harwood's role was to ensure the discovery appeared completely natural, to document the finding in a way that would withstand scrutiny from security officers looking for German deception, and to make sure the map reached the right people in the right sequence so that it would have maximum impact on decision-making. The entire operation was so secret that even Eisenhower wasn't aware of it. Told the truth until after the war, when Churchill finally revealed to him over dinner in 1946 that the map discovery had been staged. A revelation that reportedly left the former Supreme Commander speechless for several minutes before he began laughing at the audacity of British intelligence. But the most tragic part of the story, the part that gives the entire operation a dark undercurrent, concerns what happened to Oberst von Schellenberg, the German officer who had risked everything to provide the Allies with the intelligence they needed. The files revealed that Schellenberg was arrested by the Gestapo on June 3, 1944, 3 days before D-Day, after someone in his office noticed irregularities in document access logs and launched an investigation. He was interrogated for 3 days, tortured to reveal his contacts and his methods, but he revealed nothing, protecting both his Allied handlers and his fellow conspirators in the German resistance. And on June 6, as Allied troops were landing on Normandy beaches, he was executed by firing squad at Fresnes prison outside Paris. The bitterest irony is that Schellenberg died never knowing whether his sacrifice had made any difference, whether the documents he had risked his life to provide had reached Allied commanders in time, whether the invasion had succeeded or failed, because by the time the landing began, he had been in Gestapo custody for 3 days, cut off from all information about the war's progress. British intelligence learned of his arrest and execution through their networks in France, and there was apparently a serious discussion about whether to try to break him out of prison or at least get a message to him confirming that his information had been crucial to the invasion's success. But the risk to other ongoing operations was considered too great, and the decision was made to do nothing, to let him die without knowing that he had helped save tens of thousands of Allied lives, and enabled the successful invasion that would ultimately destroy the regime he had been fighting against. The files also revealed something that raises even darker questions about the moral calculations of intelligence work during wartime, which is that British intelligence knew about Schellenberg's arrest within hours of it happening, but made no attempt to warn him or extract him, because his arrest and execution actually helped to convince the Germans that there had been no security breach regarding the Atlantic Wall defenses, that if there had been a spy in Rommel's headquarters, he had been found and eliminated before he could pass any information to the Allies. In other words, Schellenberg's death served as confirmation to German intelligence that the map discovery was genuine and accidental, not part of an Allied intelligence operation, which helped to maintain the credibility of the overall deception plan and keep the panzer divisions away from Normandy during the crucial first days of the invasion. The question of whether British intelligence could have or should have tried to save Schellenberg remains controversial among historians, with some arguing that his sacrifice was a necessary part of the larger operation, and that trying to extract him would have risked the entire deception plan and potentially thousands of lives, while others insist that abandoning an agent who had provided such crucial intelligence was a moral failure regardless of the strategic justification. What's clear from the files is that the decision was made at the highest levels, with Churchill himself signing off on the order to take no action that might compromise the deception operation, and that the guilt over this decision haunted some of those involved for the rest of their lives, with at least one intelligence officer leaving a letter to be opened after his death in which he expressed regret over what he called the necessary murder of a brave man who deserved better from those he had helped. The captured map itself, the physical document that changed the entire course of the invasion, was kept in a secure vault at MI6 headquarters until 1974, then transferred to the Imperial War Museum where it remains today, available for researchers to examine but surrounded by enough security to protect what is considered one of the most significant intelligence artifacts of World War II. The map has been analyzed by military historians, conservators, and intelligence experts, all trying to extract every possible detail about German defensive preparations and the methods used to create such comprehensive tactical intelligence. And what they've found is that the document represents an extraordinary level of detail and accuracy, with even minor defensive positions and supply dumps marked with precision that suggests Schellenberg had access not just to overview maps, but to detailed tactical plans created at the division and corps level. In the decades since the truth about the map was revealed, it has become a case study taught at intelligence schools and military academies around the world, used to illustrate the complexities of intelligence operations, the moral ambiguities of espionage, the importance of protecting sources and methods, and the sometimes terrible choices that must be made when individual lives must be weighed against strategic objectives. The story has also become a reminder of the debt owed to people like Heinrich von Schellenberg and countless other members of resistance movements and intelligence networks who risked and often lost their lives fighting against fascism from within enemy territory. People whose names are largely unknown and whose sacrifices have been classified or forgotten, but who played crucial roles in determining the outcome of the war. The farmhouse, where the map was supposedly discovered, was destroyed in later fighting and never rebuilt. And today, nothing marks the spot except a small plaque erected in the 1980s by British veterans that mentions a significant intelligence discovery. Without going into details, and most people who pass the site have no idea that it was the location of a staged operation that helped change the course of history. Captain James Harwood, the MI6 officer who played the role of lieutenant discovering the map, survived the war and returned to intelligence work, eventually rising to a senior position in MI6 before retiring in 1968. And according to the files, he never spoke publicly about the operation, even after it was declassified. maintaining until his death in 1991 the professional silence of a career intelligence officer who believed that some secrets should remain secret, regardless of what the official documents say. The map that changed the entire war plan wasn't just a piece of paper, or even just an intelligence coup. It was the focal point of an operation that combined brilliant strategic thinking, extraordinary bravery, sophisticated deception, and a willingness to make morally complex decisions that prioritized victory over individual lives. And whether we judge those decisions as justified or tragic depends on whether we believe the ends of defeating Nazi Germany justified the means of abandoning a man like Schellenberg to this fate.